This is Bob Kutner, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
7, 6,
5, 4. We have main engine start. 2, 1.
Booster ignition and liftoff.
Countdown to launch. Fall TV 2010 on the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web, and by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide. My name's Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, Episode 5 for Thursday, October 7th, 2010. Today we have the privilege of speaking to writer Rob Kutner, who is a 5-time Emmy Award winner and comedy writer for shows like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Dennis Miller Live, the upcoming Conan O'Brien show, and much, much more. I think you're going to love the interview, so let's just dive right in. This is great, and I'm here with 5-time Emmy winner, Grammy winner, Peabody winner, and Super Jew Rob Kutner. How you doing, Rob?
Hey, good.
And you're the, just to catch everybody up, writer for Conan O'Brien. You've written for The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and also you recently wrote the national bestseller Apocalypse How.
That's right.
And so you're a busy guy.
Well, I like to keep the authorities on the run.
Very cool. So we'll get to a bunch of that eventually, but first, why don't we start off with what I think everybody loves hearing is how you got started. At the beginning end, you were born in Atlanta?
Yes.
And at what point did you get the writing bug?
Well, I think part of it was that I'm Jewish, and I went to a Christian school from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, and so already starting to feel like a little bit out of place. And I think that's kind of an important psychological frame of mind to be in if you want to go into comedy.
Hmm.
I probably started specifically, when I was in kindergarten, I kept getting thrown out in the hall by the teacher because I thought everything was hilarious, and it was just my foolish classmates and teacher who didn't realize that they were.
Mm-hmm.
So for years, I thought the sketch group Kids in the Hall was just kids who were like me, that same like-minded malcontents. It turns out it's actually they're named after the young aspiring writers who would hang out in the backstage and sell the vaudeville performers or the Catskills performers jokes, which I thought was actually cool too. Wow,
very cool. And now you went to Princeton University. What did you study there?
I studied comediology and humorosity. They didn't. I would say Princeton was a great classical liberal education. They didn't have such a strong orientation towards the kind of things I'm doing now. I took like sort of creative writing classes, writing short stories and the like. But I majored in anthropology and Russian studies. So, this is something I suggest for people who are doing any kind of writing is to focus on getting like a broad education, because you'll learn what you need to learn for the trade, out here working in the trenches. But I think it helps to have like a rich and wide, knowledge base and experience of the world to draw upon for your writing.
Absolutely. You can't write comedy in a box.
Not that I knew that at the time, but looking back,
Mm-hmm.
tell my older self, tell my younger self, keep doing it.
Now, speaking of widening your scope, you actually lived in St. Petersburg, Russia. At what point was that?
Yes, if you can call it living. Well, yes, as I said, I minored in Russian studies, and I had a chance to go abroad for a semester in college, and that was also just a fantastic experience. And if you have the chance to do that in any capacity, even if it's for a short amount of time, it just widens your perspective. I had just started studying Russian, and I was sent to live with a family that didn't really speak English, and that's really the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They throw you in tongue first, as it were.
Yep, absolutely. And you were deported from Uzbekistan.
I thought we were going to talk about that. You specifically said we weren't going to talk about any deportations from Central Asian countries. That was on my writer.
Okay.
Yes, I was. I started studying one of the ethnic communities in Uzbekistan as part of my anthropology work, and I brought a crew in, and we were doing a documentary. And this was still sort of in the post-Soviet heyday, so there's a lot of corruption and people wanting your dollars. So I kept being asked for bribes left and right, and I had visa troubles. And long story short is I decided one day to just stop paying all the bribes. And I said, hey, you know what? I don't have any money left. I'm just student. It said, okay, well, what day were you planning to leave? Thursday. Okay, well, just mark your deportation on your passport. And then I brought it home to show my host family and said, hey, how do we get one of those?
Wow. And so you obviously came back, and at your first IMDb credit is Dennis Miller Live in 2000, but I imagine there's a lot of stuff in between. What was in between getting that gig and when you left Princeton?
Well, that was, I would say that was really like that was the trying to break in period, the lean times. I was doing a little bit of everything. I had a sort of part-time job writing TV ads for Disney Home Video for this company, which was a good job because I could do it. I could do nighttime hours and occasional weekend hours, and that would leave me time during the day when I was fresh to work on my writing. And so I was writing all kinds of screenplays and spec scripts, and on the side, I was sending in some jokes to my friend who was a writer's assistant on Dennis Miller Live, and I didn't get any on the air, but a few of them got some notice from Dennis, I was told. And then a few years later, I was out of work, and he got promoted to a writer on that show, and they were looking for another assistant. So he referred me, and I think the head writer had remembered that I had some possible promise. And so they brought me in to be an assistant, which was, as you probably know, is sort of like being a secretary to the writers. But in certain shows like that one, there are opportunities to skip ahead a little bit. I think you're going to probably ask some ways to break in. That's one of the ways that I would suggest if you can get a writer's assistant job. That's sort of one of the main avenues into becoming a writer in some situations. It's sort of regarded as an apprentice job to some extent, and that was the case with Dennis Miller. Basically, I was the secretary to the writers. But when I had some time in between my responsibilities, I could pitch my own jokes anonymously and throw them into the pile. And then there would start to come some times when, the room was stuck on something, and I would verbally pitch something, and Dennis started to notice some of the things I wrote and were saying. And 2 years later, there was a vacancy because one of the senior writers left. And so at that point, Dennis decided to move me up into to writer. So, that doesn't necessarily happen in every show. Sometimes people are more, they regard their assistants as just assistants. But, if you're fortunate enough to get a situation where they're trying to promote from within, that's certainly a way to go. And I'm always be grateful to Dennis for giving me my first break.
Mm-hmm. And you were there for 78 episodes?
Well, I didn't count, but you make it sound like a prison sentence, like I was marking them off on this. I was there for 3 HBO seasons, which is something, it's like 20-something, 26, if I were to use math, 3 years, which is like these sort of like half-year seasons that they do on cable.
Mm-hmm. So that must have been a tremendous experience. I imagine from what I understand about the process in these shows, there's just a lot of bandying jokes around. Is that true? Yeah.
I mean, it's just these brilliant, cracked up geniuses that I was working with, and I learned so much from. Like, we would sit at lunch, and for some reason the game was like, we'd think of, gay names for Holocaust concentration camps. I mean, it was just like the kind of psychotic, disturbing like wordplay and banter that we get in, and that was just like in our off time. Mm-hmm. And then, it was a pretty concentrated work environment. Like, we would all go to our offices and work. And then Dennis would come on Friday for the show day, and we'd sort of sit around and he'd abuse us for about 45 minutes. He'd go around the room one by one and abuse us in the most erudite and verbally high-flown way that you'd imagine. And then we'd get into the show, and then there was sort of kind of a real kind of pressure cooker atmosphere. But I think it was good because it really concentrates the mind.
Mm-hmm. And so what did you take away from that process on future shows?
I went from there right to the Daily Show as my next job. I don't mean I went right to it, but I mean,
mm-hmm.
I applied and wrote a bunch of writing samples and went through a whole process. And then the next job I went to when the Dennis Miller Show was canceled was the Daily Show. And, every show has a different environment for working. So the Daily Show is just generally more collaborative. And that's really more of a bantery atmosphere, I would say, because we have these morning meetings where we watch the footage, and John comes in, and just the ideas, and usually stuff that's not really relevant, but is making everyone laugh is what's going. But that all kind of, juices up the system. So, if you were looking at it like a Japanese productivity expert, it wouldn't be the most efficient process. But I think you need to go through all that, to get to the good stuff. So there's just like a freewheeling. There's probably 25 people in the meeting, writers and producers and all kinds of people. So that's very collaborative. And then you go off and write something a little bit, and then it goes back into a collaborative process where a couple people are sort of feeding through the script and rewriting it. And then that's different from Conan, I think, in a way, too. The Tonight Show and the current one, where I'm a monologue writer, and so I sort of work individually and write my jokes. And then, but right now, what we're doing is we're pitching ideas for the new show. So we're all kind of meeting together and just sitting around pitching all kinds of ideas, and then like they'll get like bumped around the room, and people will go off on all kinds of tangents. And sometimes we'll come up with a completely different take than we started out with. So there's all different variations on it. So
it sounds like it's a very fun process, but it's at the same time high pressure.
Yeah, there's some element of both those things. I mean, like, you know, if you everyone I think has a dry day now and then where like you're just not on, and so you know you can afford to sort of sit back and listen a little bit more some days than others, and other days you're going to be wired up, and hopefully you'll be providing some of the ideas. So I think it's not like a constant need to deliver ideas. It's just that you sort of have to be part of this team where you kind of rotate through contributing your share when you feel, you know, inspired to.
Now, you've also written humor and feature pieces for the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, Esquire, Maxim. Can you talk about how that integrates? Like, I mean, you at the same time you did over 1,000 episodes of The Daily Show. How did you get time to do this other stuff?
What is it with you in the county of episodes? I feel like you're reporting to a Japanese productivity expert somewhere, but what you're talking about a lot is primarily pieces that I wrote when I was trying to break into the TV industry. So there's probably a good 5-year period from when I set foot in LA, and I was even starting before that. I was writing. I actually spent a year studying at a yeshiva in Israel, and I was also working on a Frasier spec script, if you can imagine, at the same time. So I was kind of getting a taste for it early. But what I did while I was, you know, pounding the pavement and trying to make contacts and trying to get a foot in the door in LA was I was pitching freelance pieces to, like you said, like the Times, and Maxim was a good employer for a while because you could do these crazy sidebar pieces. Like I had one on like how to start your own boy band, or what to do with the Razor scooter now that they're not cool anymore. You could do things like that, and they paid pretty well back when we had magazines and newspapers. Yeah. So I mean, so freelancing was a way to both try to stay creative and also to, you know, get a little money. That's its own set of challenges, is trying to break into those things. But you know, if you have friends who work for those things, or you know people who know people, and you're very persistent as you have to be, you can pitch a bunch of times, and maybe you'll finally get a hit, you know, and then you get a clip, and then you get another clip, and then if you say I wrote something for the Washington Post, that can help open another door. And you know, that was a career I could have pursued, become more of a writer, but it wasn't really my main one, so I didn't stay with it. But I just sort of used it to help pay the bills.
Cool. Now, we'll get to Apocalypse How a little bit later, but first, I'd love to talk a little bit about your process, and in particular the process of comedy writing, because it's very different than the process of writing for dramatic shows and that kind of thing. One question that comes up as I've read a couple of comedy books is there's a strong opinion out there that if you want to write comedy, you have to do stand-up. How do you feel about that?
I don't think that's so clear-cut. I would say I think it helps. I mean, I really didn't do very much of it. I'm at best a dilettante, and I could probably say I've gone out maybe 10 times in my life. So there's definitely people who come out of that back end. I think if you're someone who like knows that you're a funny person and you're thinking about how to write jokes and how to find your voice and to do all that, I think it's a good exercise because it's sort of the best focus group you can imagine, and really tough audiences, which I think is a good way to test how thick your skin is, because I can't emphasize enough like how tough you have to be against rejection and indifference, because you're just going to face that if you're trying to break into the entertainment industry, just years and years of it. But those open mic nights are just brutal, but I think they can be a good training ground. I think I was someone who sort of started out a little bit earlier in life doing a lot of writing of all kinds, and like already focusing on what kinds of writing I was going to do. I started out with a writing partner whose brother had become a writer on The Simpsons, and so I had maybe more of an idea of exactly what I wanted to do earlier. But I think if you're just sort of exploring it as something you want to do, I think it's a good way to like really get your feet wet and test out how to make people laugh and how to write jokes and that sort of thing. And I think it can be really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think it can be a great asset.
Mm-hmm. And now I know with dramatic writing and feature writing, they always recommend writing groups. But are there places that you can meet with other people that are trying to write comedy?
I don't actually agree with that suggestion. I think writing groups tend to be sort of either like backchatting sessions or people sort of all out to get each other and sort of like passive aggressively tearing each other down. Like I'm sure there are good ones that work, but my experience with writing groups has been they're sort of more like, therapy sessions or support groups. I think the better thing to do is to find like a handful of people who you think are good readers and good critics. They can be friends. It might be good if they're not like your best friends or like definitely not your mom, because they're going to think whatever you do is awesome. Maybe just people you think who definitely have a critical bone and can articulate what they like and don't like about something. And maybe some of them are in the industry as well and are doing the same thing as you. It's always good to trade scripts with people who are trying to do the same thing. But also some people who are just like, the audience that you're hoping to get one day, like smart people that, can give thoughtful feedback.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to pop in a few Twitter questions as we go. One of them is from, let's pull up my Twitter here, from Anthony, who asks, what's the best way to pitch a script if you don't have a production company? I have an original idea.
Well, that's a real tough question. I mean, that is kind of the challenge for everybody. I mean, even people who are very accomplished are always like facing the new challenge of how to get your attention with something. I mean, the first thing is when you say you're trying to pitch an idea, I mean, you definitely have to have a script if you're not an established writer. And even if it's not necessarily the thing you're trying to sell, you need to have like a really good sample of screenplay or spec script or pilot script, so that, because otherwise you're just some guy walking in the door saying, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if we could do so and so?" For a show. You have to show that you can actually execute it. Otherwise you're like your dad's friend who comes up to you and says, "Hey, I got a great idea for a sitcom. My workplace is crazy." You're sort of like one step removed from that. So the most important thing is to have written something. And I think to get to that point, you're probably going to have to write a bunch of things that will never see the light of day. I mean, I certainly did. I've probably written, I think, 7 or 8 screenplays that very few people have seen. And I'm going to say maybe like 13 or 14 TV spec scripts, only a few of which have been part of anything, maybe even more than that. You really have to like exercise the muscle to get to the point where you have a really good sample that you can show people to represent your work. And if you reach that point, that can get you work. People will want to meet with you and hear your other ideas, if not necessarily that one. So in a way, you don't start with the pitch. The pitch is the kind of like how you close the deal once you've gotten your foot in the door with the actual execution.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a question along the same lines from Adam Keel is, what's your recommendation for someone who wants to write comedy professionally but didn't go to school for it? And I'll pepper in there. I know there are a number of books about comedy writing. Would you recommend them, and what else would you recommend?
Okay, well, I think you may have gotten a sense from my earlier answer about my own education, is that I think you definitely don't need to get a college or graduate level education to do it. I mean, I think in some cases it can be a helpful environment for structure and like deadlines and having a good feedback group, but I also think that you can also construct those things in your own life. And in a way, it's better for you to do that, to create your own set of disciplines and find people who can give you good feedback, because I think that sort of helps your long-term process. And, if you're thinking of going to grad school to get an MFA or something like that, you're talking about saddling yourself with a lot of debt only to come out 2 or 3 years later and just be a PA like everyone else, a production assistant, which you could have just done without going to grad school. So I'm not a big proponent of that. I mean, I think it can be helpful, but I think you definitely might be better off doing it, through experience. As far as books, there's just a handful that I really like. My favorite by far is called The Comic Toolbox by John Borhaus, Vorhaus, and that's a sort of a he's an accomplished sitcom writer. He's written for a lot of great shows like I think Head of the Class and Barney Miller and some other classic shows. But he also is really good at explaining how to do it, which is not, usually don't find this, those who can't do, teach those who can't, that sort of thing. He can do both. And I always go back to that guy as a reference for writing sketches or sitcoms or features.
Mm-hmm.
For a screenplay writer, I think a really good one is called The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, Vogler, which sort of boils down the screenplay story into like the archetypes of like the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell, and that's something that Hollywood sort of follows. Like Disney has given all its executives a boiled down version of that book, but I find it really helps the way you think about a story. There's a new book called Save the Cat by Blake Snyder that people are really into for features right now, and I think it's very helpful for some people as well.
Mm-hmm. I've just been holding up the books as you as you mentioned them.
You have them all on your
yeah, I have them all on my shelf. Yeah, great recommendation. I'm definitely a proponent of reading a lot of books.
Well, I don't think they're all necessarily valuable, because some of them I think are a little bit more abstract or maybe a little bit dated in a certain sense. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I can stand by the ones that I suggested as having sort of timeless advice.
Yeah. And another couple of questions here from Twitter. I think this one actually ties in a little bit to what I'm thinking for a question. Jason McCraw asks, how do you find time to write in between all those ingenious nonstop tweets?
Well, there's sort of a balance that I'm still trying to strike with that. I wouldn't say I found it. I think Twitter I'm having a little bit too much fun on. When I was unemployed between Conans, as they say, I had about 7 months there, and I didn't really have an outlet. And Twitter is like this heroin, this morphine drip of validation for you write a joke and like some stranger, I think very often Jason McCraw, in fact, will like retweet it or respond to it, something like that. And so it's like this very like needy, neurotic, broken comedy writer's crutch. I think in a way, like if I should probably have done less of it, and I could have gotten more done in real projects. So it's definitely like a challenge and a balance. I would say though, in the same way that I talked about stand-up, that if you're starting out, it can be a good way to test material on people. Like if you start writing stuff that gets a response, or you start gathering a following, I think that can be a good way to sort of see what people are responding to and what kind of jokes will work for you and that come naturally out of you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and my question is, particularly with shows like Jon Stewart and Conan O'Brien, I am amazed by the level of just political references and pop culture, and it seems like as a comedy writer, you must have to do a lot of research on that stuff.
Well, I mean, there's a blend. I mean, like we have to, the Daily Show, certainly what we have to do is kind of bone up on issues, and we had this fantastic researcher named Adam Chodikoff, who's the producer on the show, and he's like the sort of brain of the show. Like he remembers all that has happened politically, but he also would supply all the research and information. And so if we were really delving into the story, we'd have to read up on it that day, like quick homework assignment. Mm-hmm. As far as the pop culture stuff, I mean, you can't really like research every movie, but I think you'll find in a typical comedy room, the kind of people who do that tend to be like all comedy, pop culture nerds, and there's definitely people who are also walking encyclopedias of like every 80s sitcom or like every obscure movie, and to be conversant with the stuff that's coming out as well too. I think you have to just sort of keep up. I think you don't want to be a monk here. You have to be like sort of plugged into the culture in order to do it, in order mm-hmm. to help create it.
Yeah, and Jack and Pollux has a funny question: how stoned do you have to get to produce your best TV writing?
Well, if you mean stoned by the angry mobs, I think that's a sign of validation. Certainly, you're doing something right. If you mean the conventional kind, or as they call it, glaucoma treatment here in California, mm-hmm. I think it's actually. I honestly think it's certainly something I've indulged in, but I think it's actually not a great idea for writing, because I think that people around like, oh yeah, it makes you free and creative, but I think in the fact you have to marry your free-ranging creativity to like a sort of discipline, and like writing jokes is a very focused activity, and I think also definitely writing scripts and structure and all that, like you can, if you sort of get unfocused, you get a mess. Mm-hmm. So I think I certainly don't have a problem with recreational use, but I don't recommend it to anyone. Now Benadryl, that's a different story entirely.
Yeah. I think allergies are not helpful to any writer.
Especially children.
Yeah. Joanna Nuval asks, has the rise of websites such as YouTube or Funny or Die shifted the writing focus to create edgier viral videos? And if so, how?
I think it's definitely created a market for that and a model that, like I was saying, you need to write scripts and all that to have your samples. And I think nowadays people can make videos that can make samples. Funny or Die has raised the bar in terms of production values, which, means that these things really have to look polished. And nowadays people want someone famous in it. But I think if you do something really good and original, it can stand for your work. Maybe YouTube has lowered the bar in the other direction, where if you have a cat basically in a camera, then you've got a YouTube video.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's definitely lowered the barrier in a way that everyone can do it. And if you live in a place, whether it's New York or LA or even Austin or San Francisco or Boston, where there's creative people around who have skills and have equipment and maybe they work at a regular job, but they want to do some creative, I would say try to find people like that and put your own thing together, because there's a lot of talent out there and there's only so many outlets. But, people will do fun projects, and if you're all just trying to make a name for yourself, I think that's something that's very doable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know I definitely have heard that, obviously you've got to produce something of quality, but producing your own web series, if you can make it work and get an audience, that's definitely one other way that that you can get noticed that might not have been available 10 or 15 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think creating a series is very hard. Create a good one. I've had a couple of shots at it, and I haven't always been happy with how it turns out. So, I mean, you have to really have something that will sustain and that you can do fairly easily and cheaply, and that has a sort of page-turning suspense value that people want to come back to, and it stands out from everything else. So there's a lot to do in terms of doing that right. But I think even just doing a one-off that has a lot of richness to it and has a lot of originality is a good way to go as well. And it might be a little bit more doable if you've never made videos or stuff before.
Yeah, and one quick question, and I do want to just get a couple of quick comments about your book. Lady Fantastic asks, why aren't the writers of a show always credited? Do industry people know they write on a show?
Well, I think they actually are. It's just that if you look nowadays, they make the credits so tiny and so fast. If you're watching the end of Mad Men and they show next week, then suddenly the credits become 2-point size, tiny scrawls on the screen. So basically, if you have a DVR, you can usually find anyone's credits. There's probably a couple of cases where the shows are not Writers Guild signatory, which means they're not necessarily required to show the writers or the staff, or more often the case is they don't call them writers, they call them producers. So you might actually see a lot of shows like this, all kinds of people named producers, usually consulting producer, supervising producer, that sort of, or even consultant, especially on the cable, the VH1 type shows, you'll see that. Or I have some friends who write for The Soup, but they don't call them writers because they're not a Writers Guild show. So, a lot of times the producer title will actually mess that. So I think in most cases, people do get credited, but sometimes you just have to do a little work to find it. And as far as does the industry know, I mean, the industry doesn't really watch credits. The industry goes by IMDb, and, if you're hopefully getting a chance to meet with someone, they're going to look you up on IMDb, and you can certainly, refer to your own credits. So I appreciate the concern, but I think it is, there is some awareness.
Yeah. And now your book. Your book is a national bestseller, Apocalypse: How Turn the End Times into the Best of Times. Disaster movies never get old. I love them. But what prompted you to write this book?
Well, there's a couple of things. One of them was going back to the Jewish kid growing up in a Christian school. So, I was already made familiar with the concept of hell from an early age. So, all bets were off for me as far as a person. I also grew up in the sort of last years of the Cold War, when the whole idea of being wiped out by the bomb could happen. And there was that miniseries The Day After, which was just horrific, and I think that just freaked me out for days. And not just because it featured Steve Guttenberg in a bald mask, but I was sort of spooked by that. And I think at the time I wrote the book, I was in the Daily Show, where we're dealing with a lot of toxic news and just very disturbing and dark things going on in our culture. And as we sort of turn those things into irony and sort of saying the opposite of something in a really exaggerated, cheery, thumbs up kind of way, was our way of coping with that, as you see on the show. And this was sort of a version of that, I think, where I had that voice in my head, and I dealt with all these dark scenarios with a really kind of like feel good, here's why everything's going to be great attitude.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. And I know there's a website, apocalypsehowthebook.com, but how else can people find the book?
Well, it's still on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and the website also directs people to that stuff as well. If you follow my Twitter feed, as I imagine some of the people have heard about this, sent the questions, and it's just @apocalypsehow, one word, and that will also direct you to how to buy it as well. Otherwise, you're just going to have to walk along the sidewalks with those guys who have the towels out, with like the 1978 New York Times cookbook and big book of puzzles, and if you're lucky, maybe you'll find one there. I happen to think it'll be the last book anyone will need after the end time. So if you want, you could just wait until the big one happens and then just read the book that everyone's reading. Talk about a bestseller.
Yeah, very cool. So @apocalypsehow on Twitter, and you do interact with people on Twitter. I see that, and so people definitely should follow you if they haven't been. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time today. I know we've gone a little bit long, but really, really appreciate it. And thanks so much just for sharing so much of your wisdom, and I'm sure people are going to love it.
Well, cool. It's been fun.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Rob.
Take care.
Bye-bye. So that was my interview with Rob Kutner. So grateful he could spend the time with us. That's all I have for this week, but I do want to remind you that if you want the latest, opportunities to ask your questions of these writers, make sure you do follow me on Twitter. @GrayJones is my handle. And if you follow, you can find out who I'm going to be interviewing, which shows I'm going to cover, and you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions. Also, speaking of Twitter, if you go to tvwriterpodcast.com, not only do you have access to older episodes, but you also have access to the TV Writer Twitter database, which contains several hundred Twitter addresses for your favorite writers. So if you are looking to connect, that's a great way to do it. tvwriterpodcast.com, look for the Twitter database. You'll find also other helpful resources there, and I urge you to check them out. So until next time, I want to thank you for watching and or listening. I do want to remind you this is a video podcast. You can watch it at tvwriterpodcast.com, and you can also access it on iTunes. And if you want the MP3 only version, you can go to the Script Magazine iTunes account. That is, again, is for the MP3 audio version. Go to scriptmag.com to find the details for that, or the Script Magazine account. And for the video version, you can go to tvwriterpodcast.com and or look for TV Writer Podcast on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and scriptmag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. And by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide.